She's the royal outcast who never left the palace, the duchess who was publicly shamed and financially ruined, yet remains at the heart of the Windsor estate. This is the story of Sarah Ferguson, Duchess of York. Fergie burst onto the royal scene in the 1980s as a vibrant, fun-loving breath of fresh air, but the fairy tale spectacularly imploded in a blaze of tabloid scandal, leading to divorce, disgrace, and exile from the firm. Yet, in one of the strangest twists in modern royal history, she never actually left, continuing to live with her ex-husband, Prince Andrew. Now, her decades-long story of survival has taken on a new, urgent dimension as she faces down 2 cancer diagnoses in less than a year. This is the story of the Duchess who lost everything and still refuses to leave the palace. To understand the explosion that was Sarah Ferguson's arrival on the royal stage and the deep insecurities that would later fuel her downfall, you must first understand the girl who grew up in a world of privilege that was fractured by a profound and defining abandonment. Sarah Margaret Ferguson was born on October 15, 1959, into the heart of the British landed gentry. This was not the high aristocracy of dukes and marquesses, but the county set, a world of sprawling farms, polo matches, and a comfortable, understated wealth deeply rooted in the English countryside. Her father, Major Ronald Ferguson, was a figure straight out of this world, a dashing, charismatic cavalry officer who had served with the Life Guards. He was a man's man, most at home on a horse. After his military career, he found the perfect second act, becoming the polo manager first for the Duke of Edinburgh and later for the Prince of Wales. This position placed the Ferguson family squarely in the orbit of the royal family. Sarah and her older sister Jane did not grow up with the royals, but they grew up around them on the manicured green verges of Smith's Lawn at Windsor, watching their father play alongside Prince Philip. It was a world of immense privilege, but one where they were firmly staffed, not equals. Sarah's mother, Susan Wright, was the vivacious, fun-loving daughter of a wealthy landowner. The marriage between Ronald and Susan seemed on the surface to be a perfect match of their class and kind. They settled at Dummer Down Farm in Hampshire, a picture-perfect country estate that became the backdrop for an idyllic childhood. For the young Sarah, known to her family as Fergie, life was a blur of ponies, muddy boots, and dogs. She was a boisterous, energetic, and slightly clumsy child, more comfortable mucking out a stable than sitting still in a drawing room. She was a classic tomboy, her fiery red hair a perfect match for her spirited personality. But beneath this seemingly perfect surface, a deep unhappiness was taking root. The marriage between Ronald and Susan was disintegrating. In the reserved and emotionally constipated world of the English upper class, marital problems were not discussed. They were simply endured, hidden behind a facade of stiff upper lip politeness. The young Sarah was aware of the tensions, the unspoken sadness that permeated their beautiful country home, but she couldn't understand it. The explosion came in 1972, when Sarah was just 13 years old. Her mother, Susan, had fallen passionately in love with an Argentinian polo player, a handsome and daring professional named Hector Barrantes. In a move that was utterly shocking to their social circle, Susan chose love over duty. She left her husband, she left her 2 teenage daughters, and she left England, moving thousands of miles away to a sprawling ranch on the Argentinian pampas to begin a new life with her lover. For a teenage girl on the cusp of womanhood, this was an act of abandonment so profound it would leave a permanent scar on her soul. In a single stroke, her world was shattered. It wasn't just the divorce, which was scandalous enough in their conservative world. It was the physical departure of her mother to another continent. In an age before easy international travel and instant communication, Argentina might as well have been the moon. Sarah was left behind, adrift in the emotional wreckage. The psychological impact of this event cannot be overstated. It became the central defining trauma of Sarah Ferguson's life. It instilled in her a deep-seated fear of being unlovable and a desperate, lifelong craving for male approval and public acceptance. If her own mother could leave her, then who wouldn't? This fear manifested as a kind of compulsive people-pleasing. She became the fun one, the joker, the girl who would do anything for a laugh, all in a desperate attempt to make herself so indispensable, so entertaining, that no one would ever want to leave her again. She developed what she would later call the disease to please. Her father, Major Ferguson, while a loving parent, was a product of his time in class, ill-equipped to handle the emotional turmoil of his two daughters. Life at Dummer Down continued, but the maternal warmth was gone. Sarah and her sister were sent to boarding school, as was typical for girls of their station. She was not a particularly academic student. Her school reports from Hearst Lodge School noted her kindness and her bubbly personality, but also a lack of focus. Her real passion was for sports and for people. She was popular, the gregarious center of her circle of friends. After finishing school, she took a secretarial course and then, like many Sloane Rangers, she drifted through a series of jobs in the city. She worked for an art gallery, then a public relations firm. She was living a typical life for a girl of her background, sharing a flat in London, going to parties, and dating a string of suitable young men. One of her more serious boyfriends was a stockbroker named Kim Smith Bingham. Another was Patty McNally, a motor racing manager who was more than 20 years her senior. It was a life of fun and parties, but underneath it all, the insecurity still churned. She was a young woman searching for an anchor, for a sense of belonging that she had lost the day her mother's car drove down the long gravel drive of Dummer Down Farm for the last time. She was looking for a family to call her own, a place where she would be safe, cherished, and, most importantly, never, ever abandoned. And in the mid-1980s, the most famous, most secure, and most glamorous family in the world was about to come calling. The door was opened by the one person who could truly understand her unique position, Diana, Princess of Wales. Diana and Sarah had known each other since they were teenagers. Their mothers had been to school together, and they moved in the same social circles. Though they weren't intimate friends, there was a shared bond. Diana, too, came from a broken home, the child of a bitter and public divorce. She understood what it meant to grow up with that particular kind of wound. By 1985, Diana was the most famous woman in the world, but she was also incredibly isolated within the royal family. She was surrounded by courtiers and protocol, and she craved the company of people from her old life, people who were fun and informal. She saw in Sarah a kindred spirit, but also a perfect distraction. Diana was already struggling in her marriage to Prince Charles, and she saw her boisterous, fun-loving friend as a perfect match for her famously boisterous and fun-loving brother-in-law, Prince Andrew. Andrew, then 25, was at the peak of his popularity. He was a dashing naval helicopter pilot who had served with conspicuous bravery in the 1982 Falklands War. He was handsome, confident, and had a reputation as a playboy, which had earned him the tabloid nickname Randy Andy. He had dated a string of actresses and models, but he was now said to be looking to settle down. Diana decided to play Cupid. In June of 1985, the Queen hosted her traditional party for Royal Ascot Week at Windsor Castle. It was one of the highlights of the royal social calendar. Diana made sure that Sarah Ferguson was on the guest list, and she made sure that Sarah was seated next to Prince Andrew at lunch. The connection was instantaneous and explosive. He was charmed by her complete lack of awe in his presence. She didn't simper or flatter. She teased him, she made him laugh, she engaged him in a playful food fight over a bowl of profiteroles. For Andrew, who was used to women being either starstruck or intensely calculating, Sarah's earthy, unfiltered authenticity was a revelation. For Sarah, Andrew was the ultimate fantasy come to life. He wasn't just a prince, he was a war hero, the most eligible bachelor in the country. He represented everything she craved: security, status, and the ultimate validation. To be chosen by him would be to be chosen by the royal family itself. The ultimate antidote to the rejection she had felt from her own mother. Their courtship was a whirlwind romance, conducted with as much secrecy as they could manage. He wooed her with grand gestures. He took her to his private lodge on the Balmoral estate. On his 26th birthday, he flew a helicopter to her father's farm just to see her. She, in turn, delighted in the thrill of it all, smuggling herself into palaces and past the press. It was a genuine, passionate love affair. Just a few months later, in early 1986 at Flore's Castle in Scotland, Andrew proposed. He presented her with a spectacular engagement ring he had designed himself, a Burmese ruby surrounded by 10 glittering diamonds, the colors chosen to match her fiery red hair. Sarah accepted without hesitation. On March 19, 1986, Buckingham Palace formally announced the engagement. The country was overjoyed. The press, which was already obsessed with Diana, now had a new, even more relatable royal-to-be to celebrate. If Diana was the elegant, ethereal rose, Fergie, as she was immediately and universally nicknamed, was the fun, down-to-earth sunflower. The narrative was irresistible. The two young princesses, the merry wives of Windsor, were set to rejuvenate the monarchy. Sarah Ferguson, the girl who had been left behind, was about to become a household name. She was on the verge of getting everything she had ever dreamed of. The insecure girl from the broken home was about to become a duchess. The girl who had been left behind had finally found the ultimate family, and the nation celebrated what seemed to be a perfect, joyous match. The fairy tale had begun. But the gilded reality of royal life, with its rigid protocols, immense pressures, and the unblinking glare of the media, is a far cry from the romance of a wedding day. As the Duchess of York, Sarah would soon discover that the very qualities that made the public adore her would put her on a collision course with the ancient institution she had just joined, and that the absence of her hero prince would create a loneliness far deeper than any she had ever known. The wedding of Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson on the 23rd of July, 1986, was the last great royal fairy tale of the 1980s. It was a spectacle of pure, unadulterated pomp and circumstance, a national celebration that captured the optimistic, slightly brash spirit of the decade. While the wedding of Charles and Diana 5 years earlier had been a moment of grand, almost sacred historical significance, this felt different. This was the fun one. Westminster Abbey was filled with 2,000 guests, and an estimated 500 million people watched on television worldwide as the bubbly, red-headed commoner married her handsome hero, Prince. Sarah, now Her Royal Highness the Duchess of York, was a vision of triumphant joy. Her dress, an opulent creation of ivory Duchess satin, was a masterpiece of symbolism. Its train embroidered with bees and thistles from her newly granted coat of arms, and intertwined A's and S's for Andrew and Sarah. But the most talked about detail was the one hidden beneath her veil. As she signed the register, she wore a crown of fragrant gardenias, her favorite flower. When she emerged from the abbey, the flowers were gone, and in their place sat a brand new glittering diamond tiara, a gift from the Queen herself. The symbolism was clear and powerful. She had entered the abbey as Sarah Ferguson, a commoner, and she had emerged a princess of the United Kingdom. As she beamed at the cheering crowds, her smile was one of pure, unadulterated bliss. The girl who had been left behind had finally found the ultimate family, the ultimate acceptance. She had arrived. For a time, the fairy tale was intoxicatingly real. The Duke and Duchess of York were a phenomenon. They were young, glamorous, and seemed genuinely, passionately in love. They were the perfect B-side to the more formal A-side of the Prince and Princess of Wales. While Charles and Diana's relationship was already, behind the scenes, a landscape of quiet misery, Andrew and Sarah's was all loud laughter, public displays of affection, and a shared, boisterous sense of humor. The press couldn't get enough of them, and they couldn't get enough of the dynamic between Sarah and her sister-in-law, Diana. The Merry Wives of Windsor, as the tabloids dubbed them, became a national obsession. They were the ultimate royal double act. They were photographed together constantly, at polo matches, on skiing holidays in Closters, and on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. They were seen whispering, giggling, and occasionally behaving with a delightful lack of royal decorum. One infamous set of photos captured them at Royal Ascot, playfully attempting to poke their friend, Lulu Blacker, with their tightly rolled umbrellas. To the old guard at the palace, it was undignified. To the public, it was wonderful. It was human. Sarah threw herself into her new role with an almost manic energy. She was determined to prove her worth, to be the best, most enthusiastic Duchess possible. She undertook a grueling schedule of public engagements, opening hospitals, visiting schools, and supporting charities. Her approach was a revelation. She wasn't formal or distant. She would sit on the floor to talk to children. She would hug people. She would share jokes. She was warm, tactile, and utterly unpretentious. And she embraced the adventurous side of royal life. In an extraordinary display of grit, she undertook flying lessons, eventually earning her private helicopter pilot's license in 1987. She was the first woman of the royal family to do so, a genuinely impressive achievement that for a time silenced even her harshest critics. The pinnacle of her personal happiness came with the birth of her two daughters. Princess Beatrice was born in August 1988, followed by Princess Eugenie in March 1990. For Sarah, motherhood was not just a duty, it was a calling. It was her chance to create the secure, loving, and unbreakable family unit that had been shattered in her own childhood. She was a fiercely devoted and hands-on mother, a stark contrast to the more remote, nanny-led upbringing that was traditional in royal and aristocratic circles. She was determined that her daughters would never, ever feel the sting of abandonment that she had. The photographs from this era tell the story. Sarah, face lit up with joy, building a snowman with Beatrice. Sarah, on a summer holiday, cuddling Eugenie. She was their playmate, their protector, and their fiercest advocate. In the cozy, chaotic nursery of their home at Sunninghill Park, Sarah had finally found her sanctuary. But the very qualities that made her a media darling and a beloved public figure were the ones that began to cause friction behind the palace gates. The institution of the monarchy is a cold, ancient machine. It values tradition, discretion, and a near total sublimation of individual personality in the service of the crown. Sarah Ferguson was a firework in a library. Her booming laugh, which the public found so endearing, reportedly echoed too loudly down the hushed corridors of Balmoral. Her tendency to speak her mind, to be emotionally open and sometimes brutally honest, was seen by the older generation of royals not as refreshing, but as a shocking lack of self-control. Her most vocal critic within the family was said to be Prince Philip. The Duke of Edinburgh was a man forged by naval discipline and a Spartan, emotionally austere upbringing. He valued duty, pragmatism, and a rigid adherence to protocol above all else. He reportedly saw his new daughter-in-law as undisciplined, attention-seeking, and fundamentally not one of us. He could not comprehend her need for constant emotional affirmation, nor could he forgive her what he saw as her greatest sin, her inability to control her spending. Sarah had grown up in a world of casual upper-class debt, where bills were things that were dealt with later. Now, with access to a royal lifestyle, her spending on clothes, lavish holidays, and expensive gifts began to spiral. To Philip, a man famously frugal and mindful of the public purse, this was an unforgivable indulgence. The most profound and destructive crack in the fairy tale, however, was not one of personality, but of circumstance. Prince Andrew was a serving officer in the Royal Navy. His career was not a ceremonial one. It was a demanding full-time commitment. He was a helicopter pilot and later the commander of a warship. This meant that for long, agonizing stretches of time, he was away at sea. In the first 5 years of their marriage, it is estimated that they spent, on average, a mere 40 days a year in each other's company. This brutal reality struck at the very heart of Sarah's deepest, most primal fear. She had married her prince to escape the trauma of abandonment, only to find herself abandoned once more. She was in effect a naval wife, but one living in the most scrutinized fishbowl on earth. She was left alone for months on end to raise 2 small children, to perform a relentless schedule of public duties, and to navigate the complex, often hostile, politics of the royal court, all while the world's media watched her every move. The fun-loving, supportive partnership that had been the foundation of their whirlwind romance was, for most of the year, a long-distance fantasy. The loneliness was immense. It was into this vacuum of loneliness and insecurity that the tabloid press, which had so enthusiastically built her up, began its vicious and relentless campaign to tear her down. The tide turned slowly, then all at once. The fun Fergie narrative began to curdle. Her relatable, slightly fuller figure was no longer celebrated. It was mocked. The cruel nickname, the Duchess of York, was born, and it stuck. Tabloid front pages featured unflattering pictures of her, often with cruel circles drawn around her thighs or bottom. Her weight became a subject of national debate, a symbol of her supposed lack of discipline and self-control. Her spending habits became another weapon used against her. Every holiday, every new outfit was framed as a grotesque extravagance paid for by the hard-working British taxpayer. She was no longer the down-to-earth girl next door. She was freeloading Fergie, a vulgar grifter who was shamelessly milking her royal position for a life of luxury. The criticism was constant, personal, and brutal. For a woman whose entire sense of self-worth was built on public approval, this was a form of psychological torture. She was being publicly shamed for the very things, her love of life, her emotional openness, her physical presence, that had once been celebrated. As she later confessed, the relentless criticism hollowed her out. "I think I probably lost my own voice," she reflected. "I was so desperate to be all things to all people to make them happy. I lost myself in it." The pressure manifested in a severe eating disorder. She would secretly binge on junk food for comfort, and then be consumed by waves of self-loathing. The confident, happy-go-lucky woman the world saw in photographs was, in private, a deeply unhappy person, struggling with her weight, her debts, and a crippling sense of isolation. Feeling abandoned by her husband, criticized by the royal family, and hounded by the press, she began to seek validation and comfort wherever she could find it. She started spending more and more time with a circle of wealthy international friends who offered an escape into a world of private jets, super yachts, and carefree glamour. It was in this world that she met Steve Wyatt, a charismatic Texan oil heir. They were photographed on holiday together, and soon the tabloids were filled with lurid, unsubstantiated rumors of an affair. The damage to her reputation was immense. She was now being painted not just as a spendthrift, but as an adulteress. But the most fateful and ultimately destructive relationship she formed was with another American, John Bryan. He was introduced to her as a financial advisor, a man who could help her get her chaotic finances in order. But he quickly became much more than that. Bryan was charming, sophisticated, and most importantly, he was there. He listened to her. He sympathized with her. He told her she was wonderful when the rest of the world was telling her she was worthless. In the vast, lonely void of her life, he became her emotional anchor. He was her constant companion, her cheerleader, and her closest confidant. It was a relationship of staggering recklessness. For the wife of a senior royal to be so intensely and publicly close to another man was to play with fire. But Sarah, emotionally starved and desperate for affection, seemed oblivious to the danger. She had found a man who made her feel safe and cherished, and she clung to him like a drowning woman clings to a life raft. The fairy tale was not just fractured, it was rotting from the inside out. And the friendship that had been her salvation was about to become the catalyst for an explosion so spectacular it would make her a global pariah and shake the foundations of the House of Windsor. The fairy tale was not just fractured, it was rotting from the inside out. Lonely, besieged by the press, and starved of affection, the Duchess had sought solace in a friendship that was as comforting to her as it was reckless. The relationship that had been her emotional life raft in the stormy seas of her royal life was about to become the catalyst for a public explosion so spectacular, so humiliating, and so utterly final that it would not only end her marriage but would make her a global pariah and permanently seal her fate as an outcast. The summer of 1992 was the beginning of the end. It was the season that the fragile, fractured fairy tale of the Duchess of York would be irrevocably, publicly, and humiliatingly shattered. By this point, the marriage of Andrew and Sarah was over in all but name. They had announced their formal separation in March of that year, a move that was in itself a significant royal scandal, sending shock waves through the nation. But the divorce had not yet been finalized. Sarah was still Her Royal Highness the Duchess of York. She was still technically a senior member of the British royal family, still the wife of the Queen's second son. She was living in a precarious and ill-defined constitutional limbo, and with a staggering lack of foresight, she was about to light a match that would incinerate the last remaining bridges connecting her to the institution she had tried so hard to join. In August, she accepted an invitation from a friend to holiday in a luxurious private villa in Saint-Tropez, the playground of the rich and famous on the French Riviera. It was meant to be a private getaway, a chance to escape the relentless pressure of the British press. She took her 2 young daughters, Princess Beatrice, who was about to turn 4, and 2-year-old Princess Eugenie. Also present on this idyllic holiday was her ever-present companion and self-described financial advisor, the American John Bryan. What Sarah, in a moment of either supreme naivety or breathtaking recklessness, failed to comprehend was a fundamental law of modern celebrity. For a member of the royal family, There is no such thing as a private space. Hiding in the sun-drenched hills overlooking the villa, a French paparazzi photographer named Daniel Angeli had found a perch. Armed with a powerful telephoto lens, he was engaged in the highly lucrative business of spying on the Duchess. For several days, he patiently documented the intimate, unguarded moments of her holiday. The photographs he captured would become some of the most infamous and damaging images in the history of the modern monarchy. The initial pictures were scandalous enough. They showed the Duchess, still the Queen's daughter-in-law, sunbathing topless by the pool, in full view of her young children and her male companion. But that was not the image that would seal her fate. The truly devastating shots, the ones that would be seared into the public consciousness, were of a different nature entirely. They captured John Bryan, her supposed financial advisor, engaged in acts of startling intimacy with the Duchess. He was shown kissing her, caressing her, and then, in the money shot that would make headlines around the world, he was photographed kneeling before her sun lounger, lifting her foot to his lips and appearing to kiss and suck the toes of the Duchess of York. The pictures were a tabloid editor's dream, a perfect storm of royalty, sex, and slightly ridiculous tawdry detail. The British newspaper, the Daily Mirror, won the bidding war, paying a fortune for the exclusive rights. Their editors knew they were holding a stick of dynamite that would blow a hole in the carefully constructed facade of the House of Windsor. They planned their publication for maximum impact. The timing of that impact could not have been more dramatically, more cruelly perfect. By a coincidence of scheduling that seems almost scripted, at the very moment the first edition of the Daily Mirror was rolling off the presses in London, Sarah Ferguson was at Balmoral Castle in the Scottish Highlands. She was on her annual obligatory summer holiday with the entire senior royal family. She was staying under the same roof as her estranged husband, Prince Andrew. She was a guest in the home of her mother-in-law, the Queen, and she was in the presence of her formidable and deeply disapproving father-in-law, Prince Philip. The scene that unfolded on the morning of Thursday, August 20th, 1992, has become the stuff of legend, a moment of almost unbearable theatrical horror. As was tradition, the royal family gathered for breakfast in the castle's dining room. The morning newspapers, freshly delivered from London, were brought in by a footman on a silver tray and laid out on a sideboard for the family to peruse. And there it was, not tucked away on an inside page, but splashed across the entire front page of the Daily Mirror in huge, grainy, undeniable detail. The headline screamed, "Fergie's Stolen Kisses." The lead photograph showed Bryan and Sarah in a passionate embrace. And inside, over multiple pages, was the full devastating photo spread, including the now iconic images of the toe-sucking. The atmosphere in the room, already likely strained due to the Yorks' separation, reportedly plunged into a state of Arctic silence. The royal family was confronted in the most public and vulgar way imaginable with the irrefutable evidence of the Duchess's infidelity. Imagine the scene. The Queen, a woman for whom dignity and discretion were articles of faith, staring at a photograph of her daughter-in-law topless in the arms of another man. Imagine the famously irascible Prince Philip, a man who already considered Sarah to be a national embarrassment, being confronted with the lurid details of her affair over his morning kippers. It was a moment of supreme personal and institutional humiliation. According to multiple accounts from royal insiders and biographers, the Queen was incandescent with a cold, controlled fury. Prince Philip was openly contemptuous. Prince Andrew, her husband, was utterly humiliated. Sarah herself was trapped in a waking nightmare. She had to sit there, at the breakfast table, as the family she had tried so hard to impress silently absorbed the full, sordid scale of her betrayal. One can only imagine the sickening, gut-wrenching horror of that moment. By all accounts, she fled the room in tears. The verdict from the family was swift and unspoken. She was no longer welcome. Within hours, she had packed her bags and was on the long, lonely drive back south to London, a pariah cast out from the royal sanctuary. The heavy gates of Balmoral Castle, the private heart of the monarchy, had slammed shut behind her. For Sarah, they would never truly reopen. The public fallout was a tidal wave of condemnation and ridicule. The toe-sucking scandal, as it was immediately and forever known, became a global news story. But it wasn't just a scandal, it was a joke. The specific, slightly bizarre nature of the act made her an object of international mockery. Late-night talk show hosts, comedians, and newspaper columnists around the world had a field day. The story was just too tawdry, too absurd to be treated with any seriousness. There was virtually no public sympathy for Sarah. She was not seen as a lonely, emotionally neglected wife seeking comfort. She was seen as a shameless, wanton adulteress who had brought the royal family, and by extension the nation, into disrepute. The press, which had created her, now delighted in her destruction. The narrative was complete. Fun Fergie had become fat, freeloading Fergie, and now she was Dirty Fergie, a woman with no morals and no dignity. For the royal family, this was the final humiliating straw in what the Queen herself would later call her annus horribilis, her horrible year. 1992 had already been a relentless cascade of disasters. In March, Andrew and Sarah had separated. In April, Princess Anne had finalized her divorce from Captain Mark Phillips. In June, Andrew Morton's bombshell book, Diana, Her True Story, had been published, revealing to the world the secret misery of the Waleses' marriage, Diana's bulimia, and her suicide attempts. In November of that same year, a fire would devastate a large part of Windsor Castle. Sarah's tawdry summer scandal was the rotten, farcical cherry on top of a truly terrible cake. It reinforced a growing and deeply damaging public perception of the Queen's children as a spoiled, selfish, and dysfunctional generation whose messy private lives were tarnishing the crown. The divorce, which had previously been a possibility, was now a certainty and a necessity. The firm needed to cut the cancer out. The negotiations, however, dragged on for nearly 4 years as lawyers haggled over the terms. The final decree was issued in May 1996. The terms of the divorce were a formal legal expression of her banishment. While she was permitted by the Queen's grace to retain her title as Sarah, Duchess of York, she was stripped of the crucial style of Her Royal Highness, or HRH. This was not a minor piece of royal etiquette. It was a public and deliberate demotion. The loss of the HRH meant she was no longer officially a member of the royal family. She was now a private citizen. It meant that she would no longer be invited to state functions or be expected to represent the crown. It also meant that, in a bizarre twist of protocol, she would now be required to curtsy to the very people she had raised, her own daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, who, as granddaughters of the monarch, retained their HRH status. The financial settlement was a subject of much speculation. It was reported to be a lump sum of around £3 million, which included funds for her to purchase a new home for herself and her daughters. But Sarah was already, by her own admission, drowning in debt, owing a figure estimated to be in excess of £4 million to her bank. The settlement, while generous by any normal standard, was a drop in the ocean of her financial problems. The fairy tale was over. The spectacular rise of Sarah Ferguson had ended in a fall of equally epic proportions. She was 36 years old. She was a divorced single mother. She was publicly shamed, deeply in debt, and officially cast out from the only family she had ever truly wanted to belong to. The great gilded doors of the palace had been slammed shut, and she now faced a long, lonely, and deeply uncertain journey through the wilderness. The fall was complete. The spectacular rise of Sarah Ferguson had ended in a fall of equally epic proportions. She was 36 years old, divorced, publicly shamed, stripped of her royal status, and drowning in debt. The great gilded doors of the palace had been slammed shut, and she now faced a long, lonely, and deeply uncertain journey. This was the beginning of her life in the wilderness, a decades-long struggle for financial survival, personal reinvention, and a search for a new identity in a world that was determined to remember her only for her failures. The years that followed the 1996 divorce were a brutal and humbling education for Sarah Ferguson. The gilded gates of the monarchy had slammed shut, and she was pushed out into a cold, unforgiving world. The grand infrastructure that supports a senior royal, the state-funded security, the deference of the establishment, the unquestioned place at the heart of the nation's life, was gone. She was 36 years old, a single mother to two young princesses, publicly shamed, and facing a problem so vast and all-consuming it would define the next 2 decades of her life: money. Her divorce settlement, widely reported to be a lump sum of around £3 million, was a fortune by any ordinary measure. But Sarah was not in an ordinary situation. She was, by her own candid admission, already drowning in an ocean of debt, with an overdraft at the Royal Bank, Coutts, estimated to be a staggering £4.2 million. The settlement was swallowed whole before it even touched the sides, a mere sticking plaster on a gaping financial wound. She was, for all intents and purposes, broke. Bankruptcy was not a distant threat. It was an imminent reality. Faced with a stark choice between total financial collapse and reinventing herself, Sarah did what countless celebrities, disgraced politicians, and minor aristocrats have done before her. She looked to America. While in Britain, she was a national embarrassment, a symbol of royal excess and moral failure. In the United States, she was still a figure of immense fascination. Her title, Duchess of York, even without Her Royal Highness, carried a potent, almost magical weight. And America, a nation built on second acts, was far more forgiving of public stumbles and far more embracing of the commercialization of self. Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York, packed her bags and set out to become a brand. Her first and most brilliantly successful move was to confront her greatest public humiliation head-on. The British tabloids had relentlessly mocked her as the Duchess of Pork, turning her struggles with her weight into a cruel national punchline. In 1997, in a move of marketing genius, she signed a multi-million-dollar deal to become the global spokesperson for Weight Watchers. It was a stunningly effective strategy. She was monetizing her own shame, turning the very insult that had been used to destroy her into the foundation of her financial salvation. She was incredibly good at it. She was candid, relatable, and funny. She spoke openly about her emotional eating, her battles with self-esteem, and the pressures of being judged on her appearance. For millions of ordinary women around the world who had struggled with the same issues, her message was powerful and resonant. Here was a duchess, a figure from a fairy tale world, confessing to the same secret anxieties and compulsions that they felt. The campaigns were a huge international success, and for more than a decade, her relationship with Weight Watchers provided her with a stable and substantial income. It was the financial bedrock of her new life. From this foundation, she launched herself into a dizzying, often chaotic array of other commercial ventures. She was a woman in a desperate hurry to earn and she seemed willing to put her name to almost anything. She became a prolific author. Her series of children's books, Budgie the Little Helicopter, inspired by her own flying lessons and her husband's naval career, became a modest success, even being adapted into a popular animated television series. She followed this with another series, Little Red, and a slew of lifestyle cookbook and diet guides that capitalized on her Weight Watchers fame. She became a familiar face on American television. She was a special correspondent for NBC's Today Show. She hosted a short-lived and critically panned chat show called Sarah Surviving Life. She appeared on countless documentaries and reality programs, including a particularly revealing series on Oprah Winfrey's OWN network called Finding Sarah, which followed her as she underwent intense public therapy to confront her demons. She was, in many ways, a pioneer of the modern celebrity confessional culture, laying bare her insecurities for public consumption in a way that no royal had ever done before. She also lent her name and her increasingly recognizable face to a range of product endorsements. There was a line of high-end china for Wedgwood, a collection of jewelry and home goods for QVC, and a promotional deal with Ocean Spray. At the same time, she threw herself into charity work, leveraging her still considerable fame to raise millions for causes she was passionate about, most notably Children in Crisis, a charity she founded to help educate underprivileged children around the world. From the outside, it looked like a stunning comeback. She was earning millions of dollars a year. She was a successful author, a beloved brand ambassador, a tireless philanthropist. She had seemingly turned her public disgrace into a thriving independent career. But behind the scenes, the financial reality was a ticking time bomb. Sarah was, by her own frank admission, a catastrophic businesswoman. She was financially naive, overly trusting, and a terrible judge of character. She surrounded herself with a rotating cast of questionable advisors and made a series of disastrous investments. Her American company, Hartmore LLC, which was set up to manage her various business interests, collapsed in 2009 with debts of over £500,000. Despite her huge earnings, she was constantly living beyond her means, unable to shake the lavish spending habits of her former life. She was maintaining a staff, traveling constantly, and supporting a lifestyle that her income, however large, simply could not sustain. The mountain of debt was not shrinking, it was growing. This relentless, desperate search for money led directly to the lowest point of her post-divorce life, a scandal that, in some ways, was even more poisonous and damaging than the toe-sucking incident. In May of 2010, she walked into a trap that had been meticulously set for her by the infamous British tabloid, The News of the World, and its notorious undercover reporter, Mazhar Mahmood, known as the Fake Sheikh. Posing as a wealthy Indian businessman, Mahmood arranged a meeting with the Duchess, claiming he needed her help to secure lucrative international business deals. The entire meeting, held in a plush London apartment, was secretly filmed. The resulting footage was a slow-motion car crash, a portrait of a woman so consumed by financial desperation that all sense of judgment had evaporated. On the tape, a visibly stressed Sarah was heard making an outrageous and deeply compromising offer. She promised the fake sheikh that she could provide him with direct personal access to her ex-husband, Prince Andrew, who was at that time serving as the UK's special representative for international trade and investment. For a payment of £500,000 to her, she claimed, she could open any door he wanted. "That's the £500,000, she was recorded saying, with a kind of desperate bravado. "And then you get access. You get anything you want. Look after me, and he'll look after you. You'll get it back tenfold." To seal the deal, she was then filmed accepting a briefcase containing a $40,000 cash down payment, which she laid out on the table in front of her. The story, when it broke, was an explosive front-page international scandal. The footage was broadcast around the world. It was a moment of supreme, unmitigated humiliation. To be caught in an act of marital infidelity was one thing. To be caught on camera appearing to sell access to the British royal family for cash was another entirely. It seemed to confirm every negative stereotype that had ever been leveled against her, that she was greedy, vulgar, desperate, and utterly lacking in integrity. The public reaction was not one of sympathy, but of cold contempt. It seemed like the final, unrecoverable nail in the coffin of her public life. Humiliated and exposed, with her reputation in tatters once more, Sarah again turned to the American ritual of public redemption. She sat down for a raw, tearful, and deeply emotional interview with Oprah Winfrey, the high priestess of the celebrity confessional. She did not try to make excuses. She admitted her actions were a serious lapse in judgment. She explained that she had been drinking and that her financial desperation had clouded her thinking. "I was in the gutter," she confessed, her voice breaking. "I am and was and have been a huge, over-trusting, empty-hearted, empty-headed, foolish woman." She spoke of hitting rock bottom, of her shame, and of her determination to rebuild her life once more. But while her public life was a chaotic roller coaster of fragile comebacks and catastrophic falls, her private life had settled into a pattern that was, to the outside world, completely and utterly bizarre. Sometime after the divorce, after a few years of living apart, she had moved back in with Prince Andrew. At first, they lived at their old marital home, Sunning Hill Park. Later, after the death of the Queen Mother in 2002, they moved together into her former residence, the magnificent 30-room Royal Lodge in the heart of Windsor Great Park. And there, for the next 2 decades, they remained. She famously and repeatedly described them as the world's happiest divorced couple. They were not romantically involved, she insisted, but were simply the best of friends. They co-parented their daughters with a remarkable unity. They took family holidays together. He remained her staunchest defender, and it was widely assumed her ultimate financial safety net, the one who quietly bailed her out when things got too dire. This strange, enduring cohabitation became one of the great curiosities of the modern monarchy. To her critics, it was the ultimate proof of her refusal to let go, of her desperate, pathological need to cling to the fringes of the royal world from which she had been so publicly banished. They saw her as a freeloader, living a life of unimaginable luxury that she had not earned and did not deserve. But to her supporters, and in Sarah's own telling, it was a beautiful testament to a deep, abiding friendship, a successful and modern model of post-divorce family life. The truth was likely a complex and pragmatic mixture of the two. The arrangement gave her a magnificent home and a degree of security she could never have afforded on her own. It allowed her to remain at the center of her daughters' lives. For Andrew, it provided the stable, comfortable family environment he seemed to crave. It was a mutually beneficial, if deeply unconventional, solution to their unique set of problems. Through all this public and private turmoil, the one single, unwavering success story in Sarah's life was her relationship with her daughters. She had succeeded in her primary mission. She had raised Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie to be remarkably well-adjusted, poised, and universally well-liked young women. They, in turn, became her most passionate advocates, her fiercest defenders in the court of public opinion, and the undeniable source of her greatest pride and joy. But life in the wilderness, however comfortable her physical surroundings, was a constant series of reminders of her status as an outcast. The snubs were often public and deeply painful. The most pointed of these came in 2011 at the wedding of the decade, when Prince William married Catherine Middleton. It was a major state occasion, a moment of national celebration. Prince Andrew, Princess Beatrice, and Princess Eugenie were all prominent guests, seated in places of honor in Westminster Abbey. The Duchess of York was pointedly, publicly, and humiliatingly not invited. She later confessed that the snub was so difficult and that she had instead fled to a spa in Thailand to escape the pain of the rejection. It was the ultimate confirmation of her strange twilight status. She could live on the Queen's estate. She could share a home with a prince. She could be the mother of princesses. But she was not and would never again be welcome at the family's top table. She had found a way to survive in the wilderness, but she had not yet found a way back in. This chaotic period of fragile comebacks and catastrophic falls established the strange paradoxical pattern of her post-royal life. She was a woman of immense resilience who was also prone to staggering errors of judgment. After decades of observing this turbulent existence with its bizarre living arrangements and public snubs, the simple narrative of a disgraced duchess no longer suffices. This raises a more fundamental historical question. How should we truly understand this complex and controversial figure? Was she the undisciplined architect of her own misfortune? Or was she a vulnerable victim of a cruel system? As the years in the wilderness turned into decades, the story of Sarah Ferguson ceased to be a simple, one-dimensional narrative of scandal. The initial shock and mockery faded, replaced by a more complex and enduring set of questions. The Duchess of York became a walking, talking historical debate, a figure onto whom the public could project their own changing views on the monarchy, the media, and the role of women. The central question was this: how should history judge her? Was she truly the architect of her own spectacular downfall? A woman whose fundamental character flaws made her utterly unfit for the demands of royal life? Or was she in fact a victim, a vibrant, vulnerable, and ultimately very human woman who was chewed up and spit out by the merciless interlocking machinery of the British establishment and a misogynistic tabloid press? The case for Sarah, as the primary author of her own misfortune, is a powerful one. Her mistakes were not minor indiscretions. They were colossal public errors of judgment, and they formed a pattern that spanned decades. The infamous holiday in Saint-Tropez with John Bryan was an act of almost unbelievable recklessness, a profound lack of the caution and discretion that are the very cornerstones of royal survival. Nearly 2 decades later, the Cash for Access sting operation revealed a woman who, even in middle age, still possessed a troubling lack of awareness of the ethical lines a figure associated with the British crown simply could not cross. Her chronic financial mismanagement and inability to live within her means further painted a picture of someone with a staggering sense of entitlement and a fundamental lack of discipline. Perhaps most compellingly, her emotional, impulsive, and tactile temperament was the polar opposite of what the job of being a senior royal requires. She was, as one commentator acidly put it, a square peg in a round crown-shaped hole. However, this is only half of a very complex story. The case for Sarah as a victim of a cruel system is equally compelling. She joined the royal family at the precise moment the British tabloid press was entering its most feral and unregulated phase, and the level of personal, often misogynistic cruelty she endured is difficult to comprehend today. A deeply ingrained double standard was at play. Prince Andrew's exploits as Randy Andy were treated with lavish amusement, while her infidelity was a national betrayal. Furthermore, a modern psychological reading of her story reveals a woman crying out for help. Her emotional eating, her compulsive spending, her desperate need for affirmation, all can be seen as coping mechanisms for the unhealed trauma of her mother's abandonment. Like her friend Diana, she was a vulnerable young woman thrust into a rigid, emotionally sterile institution that had no idea how to support her, a system that did not nurture but consumed. Perhaps the most fascinating and controversial aspect of her later life is her unwavering, almost fanatical loyalty to her ex-husband, Prince Andrew. This loyalty was tested in the most extreme way imaginable when he became engulfed in his own catastrophic scandal. His friendship with the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein and the subsequent damning allegations of sexual assault made against him. As the royal family distanced themselves and stripped him of his titles, Sarah remained steadfastly in his corner, becoming his most vocal public defender. To her critics, it is the ultimate proof of her terrible judgment, a moral blindness born of a codependent need to protect her own comfortable lifestyle. But to her supporters, and perhaps to Sarah herself, this loyalty is her defining virtue. For a woman whose entire life was shaped by the trauma of being abandoned, the idea of abandoning the father of her children, no matter the accusation, is a psychological impossibility. And so Sarah Ferguson carved out a role for herself that had never existed before, the unofficial royal, the permanent royal adjacent. She is not in, but she is not entirely out. She is the loyal ex-wife, the devoted mother of princesses, and a permanent fixture in the strange twilight world of the Windsor estate. A woman who proved that while the great gilded doors of the palace may have been slammed in her face, she could still find a way to live, quite literally, just down the hall. Just as her story appeared to have found this strange and lasting equilibrium, a new and far more personal crisis emerged, a battle that had nothing to do with princes or the press, but with her own mortality. In the summer of 2023, she was diagnosed with breast cancer, undergoing a grueling mastectomy. She confronted the crisis with a raw, unfiltered candor that became her greatest strength, earning a wave of public warmth and admiration. But just 6 months later, in January 2024, came a second shocking blow, a diagnosis of malignant melanoma, a serious skin cancer. These twin health crises have provided the final, defining lens through which to view her entire tumultuous life. The story of Sarah Ferguson is no longer primarily about royal scandals. It has been recast in its final act as a profound and universal story about survival. It is about a woman who has endured abandonment, global humiliation, financial ruin, public ridicule, and now the terrifying cruelty of a double cancer diagnosis. And through it all, she has simply, stubbornly, and miraculously refused to be broken. In the quiet wake of these battles, there have been small but significant signs of a final, gentle rehabilitation within the royal family itself. After decades of exclusion, she has been invited to join the family's traditional Christmas walk to church at Sandringham, a gesture of immense symbolic weight, a quiet acknowledgement of her enduring place, not as a working royal, but as the mother of the king's nieces. What then is her ultimate legacy? For many, she will always be a symbol of scandal. But with the compassionate lens of passing time, her story reveals itself as something more. It is a profoundly human story about the search for love and acceptance, about a woman whose insecurities drove her to make catastrophic mistakes, but whose fundamental warmth and unbelievable resilience allowed her, time and again, to pick herself up from the floor. She failed the royal test, But perhaps her legacy is the lesson that failing the royal test is not the same as failing the human one. Her life has been messy, chaotic, and often deeply ill-advised. But it has also been a life of passionate loyalty, fierce motherhood, and an almost superhuman refusal to be defeated by circumstances that would have crushed a lesser spirit. She lost the title of Her Royal Highness, the public's adoration, and her fortune, but she kept her family, she kept her home, and she has kept her defiant, optimistic, and ultimately unbreakable spirit. In the end, the ghost in the palace is not a figure of tragedy. She is a figure of endurance. The girl who was abandoned found a way to build her own peculiar fortress, and in it, against all odds, she is still standing.